Grandma, before you watch this, make sure you've watched Wayside School Episode 3, then go back and watch only Wayside School. No numbers, just Wayside School, then come back and watch this. Hi Grandma. Today I'm going to be reading Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Lewis Sacker. Calvin. Calvin had a big round face. Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, I want you to take this note to Mrs. Zarves for me. Mrs. Zarves? Asked Calvin. Yes, Mrs. Zarves, said Mrs. Jules. You know where she is? You know where she is, don't you? Yes, said Calvin. She's on the 19th story. That's right, said Calvin. Take this to her. Calvin didn't move. Well, what are you waiting for? Asked Mrs. Jules. She's on the 19th story, said Calvin. Yes, we already established that fact, said Mrs. Jules. The 19th story? Calvin repeated. Mrs. Jules, said yes, Calvin, the 19th story, said Mrs. Jules. Now take it before I lose my patience. But Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. Now, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Unless you rather go home on the kindergarten bus. Yes, ma'am, said Calvin, as he slowly walked out the door. Ha ha, laughed Terence. Take it to the 19th story. Give it to Mrs. Zarves, hooted Myron. Have fun on the 19th story, said Jason. Calvin stood outside the door to the classroom. He didn't know where to go. As you know, the builders who built Wayside School accidentally built sideways, so he forgot to build the 19th story. He built the 18th story and the 20th story, but no 19th. I don't know if you remember, but at the very beginning of the book, I told you that there are 30 stories on Wayside School, and there is no Mrs. Zarves, and she's on the 19th story, so there's no 19th story. But there is a 19th story, and there is Mrs. Zarves, but there's not. So it gets kind of confusing. They're all, he built the 18th and the 20th, but no 19th. He said he was very sorry. There also is no Mrs. Zarves. Mrs. Zarves taught the class on the 19th story. Since there was no 19th story, there was no Mrs. Zarves. But there actually is later in the book. Kind of a spoiler, but there is. And besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Mrs. Jules hadn't given him one. Boy, this is great, thought Calvin. Just great. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't have to give to a teacher who doesn't exist. And who teaches on the story which was never built? He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story and back up to the 20th. Then back down to the 18th story and back up to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There was no 19th story. There was no 19th story. And there was no 19th story. Wait, if there's no 19th story, isn't it only 20 stories high? So really, the 30th story is the 29th story. I don't know. Calvin walked down to the administration office. He decided to put the note in Mrs. Zarves' mailbox. But there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Calvin too much, however, since he didn't have any note. He looked out the window and saw Lewis, the yard teacher, shooting baskets. Lewis will know what to do, thought Calvin. Calvin went outside. Hey, Lewis! Calvin shouted. "Hi, Calvin," said Louis. He tossed him the basketball. Calvin dribbled it and took a shot. He missed. Louis tripped on it. "Do you want to play a game?" Louis asked. "I don't have time," said Calvin. "I have to deliver a note to Mrs. Zarves up on the 19th story." "Then what are you doing all the way down here?" Louis asked. "There is no 19th story," said Calvin. "There is no Mrs. Zarves," said Calvin. There is no 19th story," said Calvin. Then where is Mrs. Zarves?" said Louis. "There is no Mrs. Zarves," said Calvin. Where are you going with the note?" "There is no note," said Calvin. "I understand," said Louis. "That's good," said Calvin, "because I'm not sure what to do." "It's very simple," said Louis. "You are not supposed to take no notes to no teachers. You already have done it." Calvin still didn't understand. "I'll just have to tell Mrs. Jules I couldn't deliver the note," he said. "That's good," said Louis. "The truth is always the best. Besides, I don't think I understand what I said either." Calvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jules's class. "Thank you very much, Calvin," Mrs. Jules said. Calvin said, but I, Mrs. Jules interrupted him. That was a very important note. I'm glad I was able to count on you." "Yes, but you see," said Calvin, "you delivered the note to Mrs. Zarves on the 19th story," said Jason. "How'd you do it?" "What do you mean, how did he do it?" asked Mrs. Jules. "He gave the note to Mrs. Zarves. What do you mean, how did he do it?" "He gave the note to Mrs. Zarves. He gave Mrs. Zarves the note. Some people, Jason, are... Wait. Okay. What do you mean? What do you mean, how did he get it?" asked Mrs. Jules. He gave Mrs. Zarves the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible. "Oh, some people, Jason, are responsible." "But you see, Mrs. Jules." But you see," said Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. The note was very important," said Mrs. Jules. "I told Mrs. Zarves to not meet me for lunch." "Don't worry," said Calvin. "She won't." "Good," said Mrs. Jules. "I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one for being such a good messenger." "Thanks," said Calvin. But it was nothing.